Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for a brand new event here on my channel. We're talking about Day of the Walking Dead. So for the special event, I wanted to focus on different aspects of the franchise. So we're going to kick things off here with a television show, specifically the mainline show where we're going to rank all 11 seasons. We're going to forget about the spin-off shows such as Fear the Walking Dead and Tales of the Walking Dead, at least for the moment being. We're focusing solely on those 11 base seasons, and I can rank all 11 now because the show has officially came to an end and the story is going to continue via for several spin-offs they have planned, which is going to be interesting. I can't wait for the Rick and Michonne show in particular. But that being said, we're also going to conclude this session today with a surprise. It's going to involve around the games, but what the surprise is specifically, you'll have to wait and see until the ending announcement for. But that being said, then these seasons, I am basing them obviously on all of the episodes within each season, including the 6 additional episodes we got for season 10. So that does make a lot of comparisons a little unfair at times, because some seasons have more episodes and therefore more potential to suck, whereas other seasons has less episodes and less opportunities to suck. But we'll kind of average things out as we go along, so to say. And let it be known that I love all of these seasons, at least certain aspects of these seasons. I love The Walking Dead as one of my favourite shows of all time, and this is just my silly personal opinion. Obviously, I connect to and resonate more with certain seasons on a different personal scale than what you, the viewer, might. So definitely be sure to share your rankings in the comment section below, but please remember to be respectful along the way, as all of our opinions are formed on our own unique experiences in life, and that's what forms the foundations of such personal opinions, which is why I definitely do not expect your list to be remotely similar to mine. I don't even expect your opinions to be informed by mine. Make sure you stick to your own opinions because they are yours, and that makes them special in and of themselves. But enough of me rambling on. This isn't going to be a heartfelt video because we're talking about a very dark and depressing show at times. This show definitely does have its emotionally poignant moments that bring a tear to one's eye, and that is what we're going to be ranking through. So without further ado, let's roll that intro and get straight into the kickoff event of Day of the Walking Dead, where we're ranking all 11 seasons of The Walking Dead. I would have done all of the unique episodes, but that would have taken me a little too much time and effort when I have a university graduation project to worry about on top of all of this. So for now, we're just going to stick with the seasons of the show, and if this garners enough traction, I might consider ranking every single episode as well. But now, enough of my rambling, time for that brand new intro. Without further ado, coming in last place is the season almost universally acknowledged as the worst the show has to offer. We're talking, of course, about Season 8, otherwise known as All Out War. This season took a total tonal and focal shift from what the show was known for at this point, so now we're no longer concerned about survival in this post-apocalyptic world. Instead, we're looking at two massive factions of people being pitted against one another. It's a very human conflict which isn't nearly as compelling as watching the struggle against the dead. The season has lots of slow episodes where you don't even see every character, so rather than spreading these multiple story arcs amongst multiple episodes, instead what we have is the occasion where one storyline will pop up that we aren't as interested in, and that makes the entire episode an absolute waste. So instead of jumping back into a far more interesting story arc in the episode, instead we're stuck with this one that we have less interest in than the others, and it's a common occurrence, this problem. Instead, what we get are no end of these episodes that are dull and uninteresting, and now you need to wait multiple episodes before getting back to a much better storyline that will keep you invested. It would be fine if the entire season was slow, so you always know what you're getting into, but some moments being fast-paced and thrilling whilst others are incredibly slow just makes these dull moments feel all the more dull by comparison, and you're just left constantly wanting to get back to those fast-paced and thrilling moments. With this season being so action-orientated, it also meant that the action went for quantity over quality, making the choreography of certain sequences laughable, because they don't have the time to plan them out and execute them as well as they did for literally all the other seasons. The structure of this season also contributes to its lack of surprises. Everything is predictable because it follows the same story template as every other war story put together. One side starts victorious, but they begin having conflict amongst themselves, driving them apart and causing them to make mistakes. This gives the other side the opportunity to get on top of them and take their advantage away, where the same power struggle occurs all over again, only for the team we're rooting for to eventually come out on top in the end regardless. Rick's group taking home the victory at the end was something everyone knew would happen. Hell, the very first episode even foreshadows it. But even with everything the season does wrong, Carl's death standing above all else, as this mistake cost the show future potential storylines. It really sucked because he was killed off too soon with too much potential to come, especially based on his comic book material. In fact, this is probably the biggest deviation from said comic book material. But even after all of that mess, the season still does have some great moments. Ezekiel's arc for one, as he becomes depressed from effectively leading his group to slaughter. It is incredibly compelling. Beginning as a confident and energetic leader, but losing that spark due to imposter syndrome and mistakes you've made is what makes Ezekiel a memorable character. In fact, The Walking Dead is great at giving each character something unique and defining, synonymous with their character, as it's how you remember them. Michonne has her sword, Daryl his crossbow, Carl his sheriff's hat, and Rick has his gun. Heck, even Clementine from the Telltale games has her hat to call her own. Ezekiel has Shiva, his tiger, and he loses her, paralleling the loss of identity he's suffering mentally. The latter half of the season also picks up the pace, especially since it switches between the storylines and characters within each episode much more quickly. Yes, Season 8 in my opinion is better than people let on. It has its highlights and it's a very bingeable season. The problems with one episode being a stinker is much less apparent when you can move on to the next episode immediately afterward. Having to wait an entire week just for another bad episode is what made the season so awful when it first premiered, and I couldn't blame people for having stopped watching after this season, because this is where the viewership for The Walking Dead really tanked. But I would recommend you go back and rewatch it now that you can binge it through either on Netflix if you live in the US, or here in the UK we have it on Disney+. So those are my thoughts on Season 8, the worst season of The Walking Dead. It's funny that I'm even including this season in the ranking because of all of the seasons, this one feels the least like the rest of The Walking Dead. It's like a black sheep and not in a good way. On the bright side, the other seasons have nowhere to go from here but up. Next up is Season 7. Much like Season 8, this season features episodes with only a single plotline running at once. When that singular plotline is awful, it's very easy to lose interest, which is what happened with Swear, easily one of the worst episodes of the entire show. I feel as though having plotlines from The Well, The Cell and Swear all in the same batch of episodes, constantly switching between them, would have been much nicer on the pacing and it would have kept everyone's interest much better. Plus it means that all of the awfulness of Swear doesn't boil down to a single episode, and I am alright with that. Though even the worst episode does a great job of establishing the reach, and therefore the insane threat level that the Saviours pose. People have already fought against them and lost, which makes them all the more intimidating. The premiere for this season is incredibly emotional, and they do a great job executing upon Rick's arc, as this was the last time he was ever overconfident and grateful. Finally, he had something to fear, for a lack of a better way of putting it. This led to amazing moments for the rest of the season, including a part where Rick and Michonne drive through a bunch of walkers with cables tied between two cars. If you don't think that that is epic, then something is wrong with your coolness radar. Just saying. The finale returns to that emotion felt by the premiere as Maggie delivers her heart-wrenching speech about Glenn, a true tribute to what I would call the soul of The Walking Dead. This season is the second worst though, because a lot of episodes are still pretty boring and put a hindrance on the pacing. The entire season feels like it's building to something rather than being its own isolated story. So naturally things only have little immediate payoff. You need to go through all out war to get the full satisfying close to the story, which doesn't actually happen because we all know how that season went. Negan in this season is charismatic and intimidating. That balance makes him such a force to be reckoned with, and so now this character can both entertain you and leave you terrified at the same time. Jeffrey Dean Morgan does a great job in the portrayal of this character. Once again, when compared to other seasons, Season 7 simply just doesn't have the balance between character development, steady pace, and action and emotion. With too many boring and repetitive moments, I have no choice than to put this at number 10 here in the ranking. But next up is Season 6. When you take into account the trilogy of Seasons 6, 7 and 8, it feels as though it starts off bad and only gets worse through time. Season 6 does have some very strong moments, including the mid-season premiere, commonly known as one of the best episodes the show has to offer. Of the big three, this episode, No Way Out, is my least favourite, but even then, its 9.6 rating on IMDb is more than justified. This episode has some major character building moments where Rick is forced to give up his love interest, proving that his sole motivation throughout the show is Carl, or as he puts it, Carl! But everything he does is in service to Carl's protection. But then we get to see Rick absolutely lose his shit. Everyone in Alexandria joins him. They take out the walkers that have congregated inside their walls, proving Rick wrong about their ability to protect their community by coming together in order to survive. This episode is a true testament to the resilience of these characters, and it's an entertaining and well-written watch. However, the rest of the season has its issues. The first half of the season is trying to adapt a very small chunk of the comics, and in terms of the timeline of the show, it takes place over a very small amount of time. This means certain moments drag out for longer than they should, they overextend their welcome, resulting in yet again another season with inconsistent pacing that infuriates you when it's slow because it just leaves you wanting to hurry up and get to the good bits already. Then there's Glenn's fake out death at the dumpster, which is absolutely ridiculous. Why give us a fake out death and waste all of that time and emotion from the audience just to go ahead and kill him off in the next season anyway? It does harm the believability in the show, and boy, it did feel like for a moment there Glenn could cheat death. But Glenn's death isn't the only thing hurting your believability in this portion of the season, because when it comes to the season taking place over a short time frame, there is an extended episode dropped right in the middle dedicated solely to Morgan and Morgan alone, once again showcasing Walking Dead's biggest issue as episodes focused around a single plot can be a major problem for the pacing of the entire season when you don't care about that plot, and this is exactly what happens with Morgan. You shouldn't drop this in the middle of a sequence where you're supposed to be invested from beginning to end, going from set piece to set piece to set piece. You can't rush through all of that, which is what this first chunk of the season is trying to do, while still also having all of this character building all at once. What they should have done is drip fed this information throughout the course of the entire season, so that then we could have had an overarching mystery as to how Morgan got to this point, because we saw him in season 3 completely unhinged, and in season 6 he's a lot more calm, collected, and he has the psychology of all life is precious. So the question is, how did we get from season 3 Morgan to season 6 Morgan? And that information, like I said earlier, should have been drip fed rather than dedicated an entire extended episode to, mind you. So there is easily 20 minutes in an episode that should have and could have been cut. But ultimately, the episode's problem is that it feels so poorly shoehorned in, and its negative impacts on the rest of the season are incredibly apparent to the viewer because you're pulled out of something which otherwise was meant to keep you invested. The second half of the season is a little better, and we get decent screen time for Abraham and Glenn before they're killed off in the season 7 premiere. Going back and rewatching helps you take notice of these things, and that in and of itself is rewarding. Plus there's Jesus, who's introduced in this season, and I love Jesus as a character. He's executed and well written here, but his introductory episode is just a little too goofy and doesn't fit the tone and style of the other episodes this season. So overall, I'd say that season 6 earned its slot at number 9 here on the ranking list. But moving along to number 8, we have season 10. This season did something never before seen in The Walking Dead. We got 6 additional episodes tagged onto the end of the season, filmed under COVID-19 restrictions. They did the best with what they could under the circumstances. It did unfortunately result in the worst episode of The Walking Dead to date, that being Diverged. This episode possesses very few characters, as Daryl, Carol and Jerry are the only ones present, and no events within this episode impact the world moving forward. In fact, the episode possesses no events period. It's basically 45 minutes of nothing, as Carol prepares some food and Daryl fixes his motorcycle. It's uneventful and incredibly bland, making it a huge pacing killer. Luckily for episode straight afterward, more than makes up for it with a character building episode for Negan. We get to see his full tragic backstory unfold, and it's incredibly captivating and has you thinking about the what ifs due to small situations that easily could have changed, resulting in a very different version of Negan, one where maybe he didn't even survive. This did the opposite of the episode preceding it and used the restrictions of filming during the pandemic to give us an episode we wouldn't usually get. Because this episode has a small cast and simple production design, it uses this simple setup to tell an intricate and beautiful story. Whilst we couldn't get our usual large-scale Walking Dead episodes, I'm glad these episodes instead were able to offer up something new and keep us enticed in the Walking Dead universe until season 11 could roll around. Splinter is a highly underrated episode, Princess is an interesting character, and Paolo Lazaro, my apologies if I butchered that pronunciation, but she's able to portray her mental disabilities so well to give an extra layer of depth to her character. It also sets up for Commonwealth, much like how Daryl's episode with Leah sets up for the Reapers. Besides for Here's Negan, these episodes certainly aren't anything to write home about. In fact, they can be quite slow at times due to the need to limit the action for production sakes during the COVID-19 pandemic. But besides Diverged, they're better than nothing whatsoever. In the case of Diverged, nothing would have been better. But hey, we did get Here's Negan, and the best part about that, as I was talking earlier about the intricate, beautiful story, it almost feels like a short film in and of itself, and so that's what makes it such a well-written episode. All of this backstory was hinted at, but finally being able to see it unfold before yourselves and fill in all of the little bits and pieces to stitch together the full story, it is beyond fascinating, if you were to ask me, seeing how the first few days of the zombie virus in The Walking Dead panned out for Negan and his wife. But I don't let these batch of episodes drag down the entire season. Instead, I look at the rest of the season, which is about as average as you can get for a television show. It has its dull moments, it has some terrible character and dialogue writing from time to time, plot holes and contrivances pile up, but you tend to forget about all those when you look at some of the incredible action sequences, as well as the stunning attention to detail and the visual effects, and overall terrifying and layered villain. Alpha is incredible from a writing standpoint, but my favourite part to the season is the tension it's capable of building. Alexandria is at war within itself, given that not everyone agrees with how the Whisperers and Negan are being handled. There is thrilling sequences in the caves too, sequences that excite you and leave you wanting more. Plus, this season does build character relationships incredibly well. Ezekiel has chemistry with basically everyone, whilst Daryl and Connie are legendary together. The Whisperers are brought to a satisfying end, and you'd hope so, as we were frustratingly forced to wait months for the 16th episode, once again due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But this season is full with characters who are absolute scene stealers, and when everyone is a scene stealer, that goes to show how much entertainment value is here, even if you are pulled out of any immersion you're currently facing by dumb writing that breaks any sort of realism you're currently feeling. Plus, the range of the season's quality isn't particularly vast. Whilst the low points aren't all that low, the season also never manages to achieve those extreme highs the rest of the show is known for, especially on an emotional scale, as character decisions for Sadiq and Carol leave you more frustrated than saddened, which is a shame because there was some potential here for some great emotion. But moving along to number 7, we have Season 2. Before Season 8, this was actually seen as the black sheep of The Walking Dead. As such, this was often the season looked at as the worst one. But every time I rewatch it, I wind up enjoying it a little more than I did the last time. Half of that enjoyment is getting to see the characters again that I know are going to be killed off before the end. But the other half is actual admiration for the shocking twists and constant immersion this season is known for. This group is struggling for survival. They aren't yet adapted to this world, and they don't quite understand how it works. This leads to mistakes and a division amongst the group. This is generally compelling character conflict which feels more organic and justified than it does in other seasons. Let's not forget the old saying that an empire toppled by its enemies can rise again, but an empire toppled from within can never rise up. That is half of the overarching story throughout this entire season, but the other half is the multi-episode goal where our characters are constantly working towards finding Sophia. It's a necessary feeling of each episode to make each episode a reward in and of itself to watch, because they're slowly but surely making progress in each episode towards this end goal. In fact, we even feel that sense of progression, like when Daryl finds Sophia's toy, so we're always reminded of this end goal and we're always working towards it. This is also the first time we see a horde in the show, and as the music cuts out, the dread is allowed to settle in, giving the audience some real thrilling moments as you don't believe anyone is safe just yet, and you're still under the impression that anyone could die at any possible moment. This leads to Sophia being lost and Carl being shot. Shane must sacrifice Otis to get out of the school alive with the equipment needed to save Carl, leading to Dale's dislike of him. But nothing jumps suddenly in logic. The tear between Shane and Rick grows organically, and it's a truly shocking moment when Sophia walks out of that barn as a walker. The performances of all the actors here are spectacular, as through body language alone, you can see how broken and defeated they are by this. Your heart stops alongside the characters, and you're truly immersed into this show. Now, whilst I do love the divide being driven between Rick and Shane, making their conflict compelling, I do also like the flow and overarching story of this season, which keeps you hooked because you're always in knowledge of what the characters are working toward. The season is still quite slow compared to the others, and it features characters that are hard to watch, to put it bluntly. I hate Laurie. I hate Andrea. And this is before Daryl's character development made him much more likable. Daryl does still have his moments in this season, especially those that he shares with Carol, but he's still a massive jerk at times. Laurie and Andrea, however, they are the most unbearable. The way they treat others, for things they say, it's horrible and awfully written. It makes me feel as though Laurie and Andrea's characters could have been handled a lot better, especially since they're both much better characters in the comics. But speaking of the comics, this show uses very little of the source material, or at least this season of the show, because that's what adds to the shock of Sophia's death, since literally no one saw it coming, not even people familiar with the source material, because it didn't happen in the comics. Since this season is more of a mixed bag than anything, I have no other choice than to put it at number 7 on my ranking. But exactly midway through my ranking is the Walking Dead season finale. Season 11 is both the best and worst that The Walking Dead has to offer. Luckily though, there are always multiple plot lines running at once, often in the same episode. It stops entire storylines from getting stale and ensures that certain episodes aren't awful for focusing solely on one awful plotline. This means the flaws of seasons prior are much less notable, but that's not to say the season is without its awful plotlines. Rogue Nation is easily the worst episode here. In fact, I can't even recall if that's the correct name of the episode because it's so forgettable. They were going for a noir-style mystery thriller. In fact, most of these episodes do go for a different genre than the last, which does make each episode feel fresh when compared to the last. But this one in particular I have a problem with, because it involves around a new character, so we don't really care about what happened to her. We only care about how it's impacting Eugene. Locally, that's what the episode focuses on. Plus, given Eugene's intelligence, him being the center of this conspiracy makes sense thematically. But this episode is just too much of a tonal shift. It pulls you out of the season entirely and causes the pacing of the season to start to drag a little. In the end, everything starts to feel rushed, including the finale, which spends most of its time giving us huge action set pieces over actual substance. Though everything is brought to a satisfying conclusion with all the characters getting a fitting ending to their character arcs, besides the ones with upcoming spin-off shows like Daryl, and it's a very exciting finale. All the plot armor for these characters is gone at this point, and you feel again like anyone could be killed off at any second. Luke was absent for the entire season, only to be killed off here, but the emotion of Yumiko's group makes the death that much more impactful. It's phenomenal acting all around, though the second big emotional moment of the season, Rosita's death, it does unfortunately fall short for me, since the entire episode that she dies in is adamant on rushing through at 110 miles per hour. Besides the rush to get to the end, all blocks feel isolated and independent of one another. For example, for Alexandria and Reaper arcs feel completely disconnected. For Reapers are intimidating and a huge threat in and of themselves, but because of this, their murderous tendencies becomes the main threat within this plotline, and you forget that the stakes behind this plotline in the first place was that they needed to succeed so Alexandria won't starve. You kind of forget about the trouble Alexandria is in whilst focusing on the Reapers, and you forget that for Reaper arc is all about getting that food for Alexandria in the first place rather than for survival of this group the Reapers are currently hunting down. Then most of the characters who fought for Reapers are killed off, only for the Commonwealth to bring Alexandria food immediately after those who fought for Reapers return, making their endeavour for food feel worthless in the first place, though Daryl and Connie do have a very heartfelt reunion which does hit all of the right emotional beats for me. In fact, the editing and the pacing of Connie's episode is perfect, it's horrific and incredibly atmospheric, and the sound design really immerses you as you truly feel this same fear as Connie does through her perspective. This episode doesn't actually have much character depth to it, so it's amazing to see how such a simple idea can immerse you based solely on the perfect execution of said simple idea, though it doesn't benefit the pacing of a wider season arc. The season also gets you excited for a particular setup, and it cuts that setup short a few episodes later, emphasizing that this season is trying to rush itself to get to the end. The idea of a small group taking on the entire Commonwealth as their people do damage from the inside is incredible. Then that moment is cut short when Carol shows up, so just like that, we click and it's already along to the next plotline just like that. Season 11 is rightfully the season of The Walking Dead, right smack dam in the middle of this ranking. But now we're going to get to move along to the seasons that I have deep admiration and love for. These seasons have such few flaws, and as such that makes them particularly difficult to rank. I wish I could rank them all at number 1, but that's not quite how rankings work now, is it? So because I have to put one of the remaining seasons at number 5, that season is going to have to be season 3. Killer Within is the joint second highest rated episode of the entire show, at least on IMDb it is, and it's easy to see why because this episode is incredible. The only episode I don't like was the introduction to Woodbury, as we spend the majority of the episode with Angia, who is as incredibly unlikable as usual. But everything that is done with the prison is incredible, from taking the prison to cutting Herschel's leg off to save him, and then the intensity of whether or not he'll even survive his wounds, all the way up to the Killer Within. It all immerses you and keeps you excited as to what will happen next. And the unpredictability makes every twist within the story a reward to watch unfold before you. But getting back to Killer Within, this episode demonstrates perfectly how character deaths are more emotional based on the reactions of other characters. I don't give two shits about Laurie's death, but the way Carl and Rick react to it and how it changes their character, that is what truly breaks your heart. Rick is too busy being torn up by Laurie's death to even enjoy the prospers of his new baby daughter. With this threat throughout the entire episode being an internal one, it shows how tough it would be to deal with, and that's what excites you. Our group was not prepared for this, and they're having to react in the situation, leading to mistakes. The idea that our characters are in the thick of things unlike they ever have been before, and yet they rise to the challenge in the end, but not without loss, is what makes the episode so compelling. It possesses character-defining moments. At the end of the day, T-Dog even sacrifices himself for Carol, leading to one of the few episodes with 2 major character deaths. These action sequences are incredible, and they cause absolute heart-wrenching emotion. Then there is the rest of the season. The Governor's threat always escalates over time. The more we learn about him, the more we start to fear him, in other words, as we begin to learn just how truly unhinged this man has become. Being able to see what makes the Governor unhinged is what makes him such a compelling and well-written villain. In these earlier seasons, when there was a lot more smaller scale and we were given the time to really explore and dive in deep to these characters' psychology, this was where the Governor was able to have that deep exploration. And this led to Rick and the Governor discussing a truce, which is also a bit of a pacing killer for the season and the only other episode I'm not largely fond of, but it still offers enough to keep you immersed and excited due to the conflict and the threat these two characters oppose to one another. It's truly incredible. This all leads to the penultimate episode of the season, known as This Sorrowful Life, where Michonne and Merle have some incredible moments and the culmination of Merle's arc plays out. We begin the show with Merle being aggressive, threatening and racist, but he ends his time on the show being heroic. His sacrifice gave Rick's group a fighting chance in the end when they defeat the governor's army through their wit and resourcefulness. It's what leaves such a satisfying taste in your mouth come the end of the season. In fact, this season defines The Walking Dead for most people because the prison arc stands out amongst the rest, and from a story standpoint, A Prison is genius. What better to keep out the dead than something designed to keep the living in? Season 3 rightfully earns the 5th place spot on this ranking list. But funny enough, in 4th place is actually Season 4. Cool how Season 4 wound up being number 4 on the list, but I digress. This season possesses the best darned episode of the entire fucking show. Too Far Gone is everything I love about The Walking Dead. Shocking deaths with huge character implementations. After all, Hershel's death impacts upon the character arcs of Maggie, Glenn, Rick, and Daryl, just to name a few. Of all the characters, he's the most heartbreaking to lose, as this comes after he puts himself in harm's way to care for those who are sick in the first half of the season. He does it simply because it's the right thing to do, and that level of selflessness is refreshing in a zombie apocalypse TV show. But it's not just Hershel's character that makes this season for me. The first 5 episodes are compelling and keep you invested from start to finish, as we're having to deal with a virus which isn't just for zombies. It starts with an outbreak within the prison walls as Patrick dies in the shower, causing him to turn. The group deal with it much more efficiently this time, showcasing the growth from the last season. But the virus Patrick had is incredibly contagious, and prisons feature very tight and enclosed spaces, putting everyone at risks, making the stakes incredibly clear from the get-go, because this sort of illness could wipe out the entire community, so time is cut short for the few who can make a run for the medicine. This urgency adds to the intensity of the situation and draws you into the world even more through your excitement. Tyrese also goes through a fantastic arc here, as he's broken by the death of Izzy and Mika in the incredibly compelling but also heart-wrenching episode called The Grove. When you have episodes like this with such few characters and a simple premise, yet it works so well through the execution and emotional impact, it gives Season 10 no excuse with its diverged episode. But getting back to Season 4, Tyrese was a very vengeful character beforehand, but now he simply seeks out life more than revenge. He doesn't want to see anyone else dead no matter what they've done. Carol revealing the truth to Tyrese about burning some people he cared for at the start of the viral outbreak within the prison is a moment filled with tension as we worry about the outcome, but then we see Tyrese's character development firsthand as he forgives Carol, and it's a very poignant moment. Too Far Gone also features an incredible speech by Rick. The performances from the actors are just as spot on as the writing. Rick is convincing, so when the governor whispers "liar" and kills Hershel anyway, it's all the more surprising and memorable. Plus he is so cold whilst doing it, again adds to the performances and how spectacular they are throughout the season. But the rest of that episode leads to the subsequent destruction of the prison, showing that in the end, there are no winners in human conflict. The bloodshed is needless, and even the victors are left with nothing. Plus we get some badass Daryl moments, which is always welcome. The season tackles these mature themes throughout and balances it with exceptional character development. Daryl and Beth work perfectly as a duo, with Daryl's guilt for Hershel and Beth's longing to improve herself. The group is scattered throughout the second half of the season. Luckily for groups they choose to have together all possess fantastic chemistry and keep you entertained. Plus it allows them all to work together towards the same overarching goal, giving you a reason to watch each episode to see how much closer to that goal they are getting. There is constant progression towards Terminus, which doesn't work out well in the end, but in the moment you don't know any of that, and it kind of adds to your excitement, making you wonder what could possibly happen next. A few of these episodes with the groups being scattered can be slow, especially since we can only focus on so many groups at once, so when an episode revolves around a group we don't care as much about as the others, then it does start to bring the pace into an absolute crawl, and once again it means that in each and every episode we can't catch up on each and every character's whereabouts and progression towards the overarching goal. In fact, there are some very simple groups in here that are introduced and then killed off all within this second half of the season. So with the bikers, for example, you never really get that depth or that background behind them, so as such you don't really care for the characters. They're just kind of exciting cannon fodder to watch Rick bury into the Frotov showcases parental instincts over Carl, which is an amazing moment, get me wrong. I love it when Rick initiates his ultimate badassery. Yes, that's a word now because I said so. It's a great moment, but it's a shame those characters were so underdeveloped by getting there. I must admit, this season does have the biggest low points of the top 5, but that's more than compensated for when you take into account the absolute highlights of this season, those being Too Far Gone and The Grove, just to name a couple. But kicking off our top 3 with the bronze medal is the first season. This season is basically perfect, but it also wouldn't feel right putting it at number 1. This is because the season is only composed of 6 episodes, and with 10 more episodes to match all of the other seasons, I'm sure it could have felt dragged out at moments and possess of those flaws that we talked about earlier, which dragged the other seasons down for me, especially with a couple of episodes that would bring down the entire season, but with that potential being there and never fully explored, there's no way to tell if those episodes, or those additional episodes I should say, would have been terrible. And now, with all that out of the way, what exactly makes this season so close to perfection in my personal opinion? Firstly, the pilot is incredible. We start with a truly shocking image that lingers in your mind as Rick shoots a zombified girl in cold blood. You're left wondering how the world got to this madness. And you're left filling in the gaps as you're thrust into this world, just like Rick is. He's put into a coma, so he doesn't experience the first few days of the apocalypse. He simply wakes up and the world has gone to shit. We experience this bizarre and dangerous new world alongside him, which immediately invests us into the show, where we're also introduced to Morgan, who's likable, but also knowledgeable, and he passes all he knows on to Rick. After Rick realizes that he can't find his family, he breaks down, and it's just as emotionally wrenching for us as it is for him, because it's made obvious from the very start that Rick's choices and motivations are linked to his family. So losing that is worse than losing himself. Plus, family is such a universal theme that it's hard to find yourself not rooting for Rick. This all leads to the 3rd episode where Rick reunites with his family, and their reunion is perfect in execution. When Carl sees Rick and goes running towards him, it's such a warm and fuzzy moment. You are allowed to finally take a breather from the insanity and the fear that this world causes us. And the emotion is even elevated by all the other characters looking over in awe, as they're clearly very happy for Rick and his family. It's their happiness that really sells you on the joyous occasion, an occasion which also comes at a loss for Shane. He loves Laurie, they even slept together, and now they have to explain that to Rick. That eternal conflict is compelling, even if Laurie has horrendous character writing that leaves you wanting to punch the character more than anything. But hey ho, you could also say the same about Andrea once again. It breaks my heart to see such a badass comic book character absolutely abolished in this manner. But this season is also incredibly small scale, and the naivety and lack of experience the group faces adds to the intensity, as you're clear about what this show is, and the dread is really built up throughout the course of the season, so the small scale actually works in its favour, as this is much more about a struggling group of survivors than it is for human conflict. This season is executed to perfection in other words, and the pacing is great as no scenes linger for longer than they should, though I must admit the finale is very anticlimactic, but all of the pieces are set up here. It's a fine foundation for the rest of the show to come, because there are hints at human conflict with Guillermo's group, but obviously in the end that works out beneficial for both parties. However, it was hinted at that this could become a problem, the human conflict within the world of The Walking Dead, because sometimes the living can be worse than the dead, but hey, without the living we might as well be dead, to quote Michonne from the 10th season. But getting back to the first season, when the finale arises, not only is it anticlimactic, but it kinda comes out of left field, because this isn't really the end goal of our characters. Not until their camp becomes suddenly unsafe. The constantly changing end goal does parallel the uncertainty of the characters, so that in and of itself is a compelling theme, but it doesn't give us anything to latch onto and to hope for the end of the season. As such, the episodes don't feel like they're really building to anything, which can be pretty unsatisfactory. It's the blemish on an otherwise perfect season. But number 2 is season 9 with a score of 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's also the critics' second favourite season of the show, and I couldn't blame them for loving this one so much. It could almost seem like this season is better by contrast because it comes after the trilogy of the 3 worst seasons. After seasons 6, 7 and 8, it's about time we got to a season as good as this. But it's not only that contrast which makes this season a massive step up from what comes before it, but the season is great in its own right. It has its own merits, especially since 2 episodes within the season, What Comes After and The Calm Before, are 2 episodes both within my top 10 favourites of the entire show, something very few other seasons can boast about. So let's talk about what makes season 9 as good as it is. The first 5 episodes are dedicated to the inter-community Rick is trying to build after the all-out war between the Saviors and the communities. This takes a complete tonal shift from the season before it, but we still get the best versions of most of these characters. All the characters have phenomenal chemistry, and because we've grown to care about them and their relationships with one another, it's easy to root for them. There are particularly thrilling sequences, such as the museum sequence, which is tense and keeps you on edge, but the conflict between the Saviors and the other communities builds. It's slow and feels organic, so when things do inevitably get blown out of proportion, it's believable. But it's also upsetting to see such potential go to waste due to nothing but everyone's indifferences. It speaks to human nature, this need to be at war with one another. It's overall a fast-paced arc with fantastic characterizations and a compelling inner conflict, which ends with such emotional poignancy. Rick also has the perfect send-off episode as we are revisited by familiar faces. Herschel's cameo in particular comes with an even greater emotional punch, knowing that the actor has since passed away. It's a great way to bring a culmination to his arc as he sacrifices for Bridge to save everyone. I can't wait to see what they'll do with Rick's return in his spin-off show. But as for the rest of Season 9, we're introduced to Yumiko's group, which is a group of characters I for one really like. They all have their unique charm and quirks, which play off pre-existing characters very well indeed. The only downside to the season is the 7th episode called Stradiferous, I hope that's what it's called anyway, and that's just largely because it's a mostly uneventful and pretty forgetful episode. In the episode, Michonne transports Yumiko's group to the hilltop whilst Carol reunites with Daryl. There are some very nice character moments here, but overall this season is one that brings the pacing of the season to an absolute crawl, and the character exploration has to start off as simple before you can start to add layers to these characters in Yumiko's group. In other words, we haven't had enough time to fully explore their characters yet, which is what leads to necessary foundation having to be laid, and that can be rather exposition heavy, which is lazy in execution and a little boring. The episode is still fine and it works in its own merit. In fact, I'd say it's better than most of the episodes in prior seasons. And if this is the weak link we're talking about here, then it goes to show how great the rest of the season is, as this season brought horror back to The Walking Dead. Rather than being so action-orientated, it brings you thrills as it introduces us to the terrifying new threat our communities face, the Whisperers. The introduction has an eerie atmosphere brought about by the fog and darkened colour palette for the mid-season finale. It foreshadows that something tragic is about to happen. Then Jesus, of all people, is killed off. This character has been incredibly capable before now. We see him as a survivor. We see him as someone who's tough and hard to kill. So with the Whisperers immediately killing him off, it goes to show that the rest of our community is truly fucked. This is a unique threat demanding a unique situation which our communities simply were not prepared for, especially given that Alexandria has distanced itself as a result of the hurt the community feels from losing Rick. It's because of the lack of preparation the communities had in dealing with the Whisperers, as well as the Whisperers' cruelty in and of itself, which leads to the communities making terrible mistakes that ultimately leads to the Pikes. But the entire season is renowned for building tension. Even the Highwayman sequence where they're first introduced, it can be quite thrilling. But Carol surprises literally all of us when she handles it with wit rather than blood being shed. Especially since she brutally murdered the remaining saviors in one of the previous episodes, so we expect her to pull out her usual character traits and be the absolute badass that wipes everyone out. But instead, the situation is handled with mercy. It suddenly relieves all of the tension and results in a rollercoaster of emotion that really sticks with you. After how badass Daryl's stand against Beta is, you don't expect the Pikes. So you're suddenly rushed by all this shock, and the music really elevates the emotional impact and the atmosphere. You understand how dangerous the Whisperers are, especially since Alpha kills her own people in cold blood just to prove a point. This leads to the manner in which the show reveals the heads in the iconic Pike scene I alluded to earlier. They subvert our expectations as to who has actually been killed, and with the music elevating the emotion, it's all so masterfully handled. It's why both this episode and Rick's last episode are highlights of the entire series. I'll always see this season as return to form for The Walking Dead, as we have excellent characters that all play up to each other's strengths very well, and there are moments of true horror and tension that terrify and excite you both at the same time, which is just a really great way to hook and entice you into the show, as you truly feel something whilst watching it. In fact, you're immersed even further through the realism of Connie's perspective as she goes through the cornfield with zombies left, right and centre, almost hunting her down, but she's deaf throughout the whole thing, so not being able to hear as the zombies approach, it really does add to the horror of it all, and the sudden shift in our perspectives is ultimately what garners such shock from the audience. It helps make the season very memorable, and the emotional impact lingers with you long after the credits roll. Even though the character choices for the Pikes were a little underwhelming in my opinion, they could have killed literally any of the characters and achieved the same effect due to the masterful execution of the sequence. It delivered what was the last true shock of Walking Dead in my opinion. I also love how the season handled the hand it was given. Killing Carl in Season 8 was a mistake, so the way they made his death feel so necessary but also incredibly tragic, since it was in vain when Rick tries to build the intercommunity that Carl dreamed of, that dream crumbles. And so without Rick's source of motivation, without Carl being there, with his tragic death being in vain, there is no reason for Rick to be there. It explains why he exited the show. And after all, he did seem like a little more of an empty vessel with fewer directions in which they could take the character. That doesn't harm how interested I am to see what they'll do with his character in the upcoming spin-off show, however. And it also explains why Negan respects Judith so much, because he sees her as a younger Carl. With all that in mind, how could I possibly put Season 9 any lower than number 2 on my ranking? But for those of you who have been keeping track of the seasons mentioned so far, you would realise that my favourite season by process of elimination has to be Season 5. I'm not the only one who speaks of this season in such high praise. It's also the highest rated season on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's the third highest rated season when you take into account the average score of all the episode rankings on IMDb, with a very impressive average score of 8.36 per episode. Even then, the only seasons beaten out are Season 3 at 8.37, a 0.01 difference in the score, and Season 1 is at 8.53, but it isn't exactly a fair comparison when there's only 6 episodes as opposed to 16. Enough about all this data though, let's talk about what makes Season 5 as good, no, as great as it is. The season has the strongest start of any season in The Walking Dead. No Sanctuary is my second favourite episode of the entire show. We get to see Carol be an absolute badass and save the entire group from what is otherwise a pretty hopeless situation. Her reunion with Daryl is heartfelt, but this emotion is raised even further when Rick and Carl reunite with Judith. This is so incredibly heartwarming, it actually overwhelms you with joy, and it juxtaposes the insane chaos of Terminus Breakout, providing a rollercoaster of emotions which is incredibly memorable. It sticks with you, and it's a perfectly captured moment with phenomenal acting, and the fact that things only got more and more hopeful as the episode continues is a refreshing direction for the show. We then meet Father Gabriel, who has one of the most interesting character setups of all time. It's because of these humble beginnings that makes Gabriel, as he progresses through his arc, such a compelling character. The end to his arc, when he opens the gates for everyone in the Commonwealth in order to save them from the chaos outside, is such a momentous moment for him on a personal scale. They couldn't have wrapped up his arc with such a neat little bow without setting such a great foundation. Whilst Rick's group did escape Terminus, the threat of the people still remains, and they catch up with Rick's group as they kidnap Bob and take his legs to eat for themselves since they're cannibals. After a monologue which gives more depth to Gareth, the leader of the Terminus group, it's great how we can truly see into his mindset and understand his twisted character. But after all that, Bob makes a shocking reveal that he was bit. The entire moment is unhinged and incredibly entertaining, and even up until the end, Bob remains true to his character, which is admirable, and it makes his death all the more emotionally impactful, as you know that he deserved so much better than this. Is what makes it so satisfying to see Rick and his group put an end to Gareth and the Terminus people. Their mercilessness is a great characterization for what Rick has become, what his arc at this point in the story calls for. It's badass and very entertaining to watch. The episode focused solely on Beth isn't fantastic, though I love her chemistry with Noah, and Beth is starting to grow as a character with her increased survival instinct and confidence. It's very captivating character drama, and the later episodes are much better at balancing out screen time between the different plots as we jump between different plot lines, so we're never given the time to get bored with a single one, unlike Beth's solo episode. But after all this development and the potential to push Beth's character arc further, for her to be so mercilessly killed off in a sudden twist, it's truly heartbreaking, and watching Maggie's reaction adds to the overwhelming sense of loss. This is a death that truly hits you. It's shocking beyond that, in fact. It reminds you that even in times where our hope is at its greatest, that the world is cruel and will strike you down at a moment's notice, hope is always juxtaposed by violence. It's like Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet all over again. In fact, the tragedy is also played up because the very next episode, Noah loses his home and Tyrese loses his life. He starts hallucinating, so we get to see some familiar faces again. It's welcome, but ultimately quite emotional in the end. Despite the beginning of the season giving us such hope, at every turn possible, tragedy strikes. We're reminded of the violence and cruelty that makes this world what it is, and the rollercoaster of emotions you face is captivating and incredibly memorable. In fact, I'm even making these points over and over again, just like the show does, to put emphasis on what it is I'm repeating, repetition for effect and all that. Then there is the second half of the season, which sees Rick and his group finally being introduced to Alexandria. It's a community that seems too naive and perfect to actually exist. You can't believe in this place, knowing that it'll probably end in tragedy like everything else this season, but because of the opportunity this new community offers our group, we want to see them safe and successful, so we don't want to see them lose this new community. Instead, we're rooting for them to teach this naive community how to survive, though the fear of their inexperience leading them to make poor decisions always lingers. Andrew Lincoln's acting for Rick is phenomenal at this point in the show. It's basically my favourite version of Rick, so this inner struggle within the community is very compelling and leaves me fully engaged within the show. Noah's death is also tragic. This episode isn't even a major event such as the season finale, making the death take you even more by surprise, especially since they were setting Noah up for such a bright future. He was going to become an architect and help Reg on the walls, but then, soon as he starts studying and making these notes, those notes are cut to an end, just like his life tragically is cut short. Up until the end, Glenn remains true to himself, because even after Nicholas is effectively the character that got Noah killed, he still chooses to spare Nicholas and to help him survive in this world. The finale of this season is incredibly underrated. We're reunited with Morgan, and when he chooses to reunite with Rick, it's the worst, most possible moment, and it gets you excited for how this character conflict will be concluded in the next season. But overall, I love how they handled Alexandria. A community as shielded as this, acting in this manner feels realistic, and it sets up for very human and organic conflict. Rather than a huge opposing force, the main villain is a man who beats his wife. I love how simple the idea is, and I love even more the execution of it. This episode has its exciting moments, its emotionally poignant moments, and its amazing character moments, some of the more memorable sequences in the entire show, and it's topped off by amazing character writing for a truly human conflict at its centre, which keeps you hooked from the start and never loses your immersion. That's what I could say about this final episode, which is the encapsulation of the entire season. That's just how good this season turned out, and there is no season more worthy than the #1 spot on this ranking list in my personal opinion. This is some of the best television we have ever received, period, let alone the best season of The Walking Dead. But just like that, we've now ranked the 11 seasons of The Walking Dead television series from the worst to the best. But even the best of what the television show has to offer still doesn't hold a candle to what Telltale offers with their storytelling prowess. That's right, I think Telltale's Walking Dead is the best Walking Dead media we've ever gotten and will proceed to ever get in future, which is why I'm excited to announce that as part of Day of the Walking Dead, I'll be returning to my streaming series for Telltale's Walking Dead to conclude the event with. I incorporated these games into my brand new intro for good reason, and Igniter is even wearing Clementine's hat to represent my love for these games in my 6-year channel icon. That is also why for the concluding section of this video I've put some gameplay of the very same episode I'll be live streaming to appropriately tease you about what's coming. Said live stream will begin a few hours after this premiere, and I'll be streaming for Season 2 episode called All That Remains, which is the Season 2 premiere of Telltale's Walking Dead. I look forward to seeing you all there as I bring the Day of the Walking Dead to a close, but until that moment arises, let's roll the outro without further ado. I cannot, in good conscience, end off this video without first thanking all of my incredible channel members whose continued support help make these videos possible. Without them, these videos would be near impossible to make, so from the bottom of my heart, I truly appreciate every last one of them. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, there are plenty of options on screen now to explore, and please consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. On that note, this video is coming to an end, so thank you so much as always for watching. Until the next video arises, peace!